Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We bring together the latest research in linguistics, language acquisition, and biblical studies to better understand the biblical languages and ultimately the biblical text. As always, this episode is brought to you by Biblingo, the premier solution for learning, maintaining, and enjoying the biblical languages. Visit biblingo.org to learn more and start your 10-day free trial.
Hey everyone, this is Nick Messmer, one of the co-hosts of the podcast. In this episode, Kevin Grasso interviews Matthew Thomas about his experience reading through the Septuagint in a year. This conversation inspired us to not only do this ourselves, but to help others do it as well. So we're hosting some Greek and Hebrew reading groups for 2023. For Hebrew, we'll be reading through the entire Hebrew Bible. And for Greek, we'll be reading through the whole Greek New Testament and the whole Septuagint. The process is simple. Everyone will do the readings independently, and we'll have discussion on our online community forum. We'll also have a Zoom call once per month for additional discussion. These groups are totally free and anyone is welcome to join. Just go to community.biblingo.org and join our community forum. We'll be sharing more information there very soon.
I am Kevin Grasso, your host for this episode, and I'm excited to talk with Dr. Matthew Thomas today about reading through the Septuagint in a year. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thank you very much for having me, Kevin.
So Matthew J. Thomas is Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies and Theology, Department Chair at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California, and an instructor in theology with Regent College, Vancouver. He received a DPhil in Theology, New Testament and Patristics from the University of Oxford. He's the author of Paul's Works of the Law in the Perspective of Second Century Reception, which received the Jesus Creed Book of the Year Award in 2018. His research areas include Pauline theology, patristics, particularly the ante-Nicene period, and early Christian interpretation of Scripture. Matthew and his wife, Leanne, live in California with their 4 children, Camille, Raphael, Michael, and Agnes. So you read through the Septuagint in a year, or you've almost read through the Septuagint in a year, right? This past year?
That's correct. Yeah. So I guess we have a little bit of December left. But yeah, that's right.
So just to begin with, what is the Septuagint? I know obviously like there's an easy way to answer that and a hard way to answer that. But what is the Septuagint and why is it important?
Yeah. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which you see made a couple of hundred years before Christ's advent, and which seems to be the text that is used most often in the New Testament writings when they're making reference back to the Old Testament, which is to say, most of the time that a New Testament author is quoting an Old Testament source, it seems most of the time that they're making reference back to the Septuagint rather than to what we have then later preserved for us in the Hebrew or Masoretic tradition. Now, it doesn't mean that they're always necessarily different. They are actually usually the same, but it seems as though for the majority of the apostles and for those who are reading them, the Septuagint functionally was the Old Testament for them.
Yeah, so that's obviously one reason why it's very important. So it's basically the Bible that they are quoting from. So given that they're just quoting snippets of it, what do you think the advantage is of actually like reading through it, or should we actually do that? So you're on this journey to read through the whole thing, right? Why not just take random parts of it?
Take random parts. It's good.
Which is honestly what scholars normally do, right? Like most people don't just read through the Septuagint, right? I mean, they study this part and say, oh, this is useful to me, or this is not.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, you have, it's the old dictum that, a text without a context is a pretext for anything that you want it to be. That can definitely be true with the Septuagint as well. it's also just easy to make comments that are, that are just based in ignorance, and that are pretty easily, showed up as being based in ignorance, which I think is unfortunate for everybody. Nobody really benefits, from that. For me, the idea first came, gosh, this is a long time ago. This is 2013 when I was had just started the PhD program in Oxford, and there was Marcus Bockmuel had arranged for NT Wright to come down and do like an evening thing with the New Testament students. And one of the things that he said, as far as he gave a talk, it was like, things that I wish I knew as a young New Testament scholar. One of the things that he gave as a recommendation was to read through the entire Septuagint as early in your career as you can. So to actually read through the entire Greek of it. And I remember thinking like how cool that sounded, because the times that I'd read the Septuagint, it was great. And just, conceptually, because for the early church. So if you asked one of the apostles, when you say scripture, what do you mean? They would probably mean something, like this. They mean the Old Testament. They're not referring to their own writings. They're referring to to the Old Testament. And the Old Testament for them, most commonly in that period, was accessed within this Greek translation. So I knew in my head that for the apostles, for the early church fathers who, before you have an established and set New Testament canon, when they say scripture, this is what they mean. And they explicitly refer to the Septuagint translation as being something that was commended and handed down by the apostles, and which, if you think of the power of early Christianity, they're always referring back to this text and how it is that Christ, speaks to them through this text. And so I kind of had all of those things, hypothetically, as far as like, that's a really, a great thing to do. The question is, when do you actually get around to doing something like that? Because of course, a 1 year Bible plan is already like decently ambitious, and then a 1 year Bible plan, in other languages, it's a little bit more ambitious. And so I think I got to a point in reading the text, there was enough books that I read through, in that, in previous years, I'd read through Joshua by itself, I'd read through Leviticus by itself, and the stuff that I was getting out of reading these texts, I think theologically, the things that were brought to light, the points of contact that I saw with the New Testament, and then just the sheer enjoyment of reading the text. I think those things were such that I was thinking, I've got to follow Wright's advice. I got to actually do this. And so this is an idea that came to mind a little over a year ago, to just basically follow a 1 year Bible plan, but to do it in Greek instead of English. And so we've been doing the Greek, New Testament along with the various Old Testament reading. And honestly, it's been so much fun that I'm doing the same thing again next year. So this is part of the fun thing as well. So if anybody is wants to come along next year, it's just been it's a lot of work, but it's been so rewarding. There's just so much riches that's there, so many things that jump off the page when you're reading, when you're reading it in this early translation, which was so influential within early Christianity, that you just can't process it all one time through. I think you need to go do it again. If I use an analogy, this is what I've been thinking about this, all year. It's have you seen Forrest Gump before?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you think of like Forrest Gump, he just feels like running, and so he just starts running, and he just runs and runs and runs, and he ends up running the whole way, across the country, just sort of coast to coast. He just feels like doing it, and he does it. It's a little bit like that, but then it's almost like trying to talk about it. At the end, once you get to the coast, it's sort of like somebody going in, coming to you and saying, "Hey, so what'd you see on your run?" It's like, oh my, how would you even begin to answer that? Because you got 365 days of seeing stuff all the time, and almost to appreciate and to I feel like to process everything you saw, for me, I'm just like I want to do it again. So that's part of the inspiration for doing it again next year.
Well, I highly doubt that first century Jews who were reading it would only read it through it one time. So there,
Right?
you'd
Yeah,
probably be in
absolutely.
good company.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So how are you doing it? Are you doing it like with a group? And are you meeting, talking about it? Or are you just like holding each other accountable? Or are you just doing it by yourself? Or
Yeah. So this originally started. It was myself and Jim Prothero who was doing a New Testament PhD in Cambridge when I was over at Oxford, and he was just an amazing guy. And so anyway, he's a good friend of mine. And so I approached him about doing this, and so he got on board. And there's a few other people that got on with this as well, due to just some circumstances that he had. He was doing this for a while, then had to sort of get off the Septuagint train. And then there was some other folks. We had like a Facebook group for a while, but then I mean it's kind of funny, when you spend this time reading scripture today. I just realized I just don't have time for social media if I'm actually going to do all of the, the Bible reading that's there. And so for a while there was there's a Facebook, group that was there, which still exists, which is, just kind of sharing, insights and cool stuff that was there. And I was putting up things. And then I just eventually got to a point where I just stopped using Facebook altogether. So, and so I'll still, go on occasion and go back there, but, so it's possible that there's other folks who are in this group who have kind of continued on. We've sort of reached out, open invite to anybody who wanted to do it. And it's possible that there's other folks that are still going along with it. But I don't.
You severed all contacts with everyone.
It is.
It's
interesting. There's I'm not going to say it's you're adopting the monastic life when you do this, but you do have to disconnect a little bit in order to be able to make it through something like this. I don't think there's any way around it. I think you have to give up some and kind of retreat in a sense, into the word to be able to make it through something like this. And I actually think that's really cool. And I found that to be really valuable. And I think that, in doing that, I think you tend to find that you have a lot more to give when you do come back, back out into the world than if you're just sort of, just caught up in, all of the scrolling of the universe and stuff like that. So anyway, it is following a 1-year Bible reading plan. I think I sent it to you. I can't even remember what it's called, to be honest. I think it was something that somebody had shared with me before, and it's great in that it is that it there.
Yeah. I printed it out.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So what's great is that you have an Old Testament reading, you have a New Testament reading, and then you have a wisdom reading. And the wisdom reading, you really, I've done kind of quick Bible things before. So a couple of years ago, we did a Bible in a month thing, which was a wild ride. And I actually found the books that we, I guess, had the least justice to them were books like the Psalms. When you're going through the Psalms quickly, or when you're going through the Proverbs really quickly, you're not meant to go through those kind of one after the other really fast. You're meant to, I think, take them one at a time and sit with them. And that's the great thing. Whoever designed this 1-year Bible plan is you get Old Testament reading, New Testament reading, and then you get like a wisdom reading. And so it's a psalm. It's a part of Proverbs, and you go through those, and it actually really balances things well, so that all through those do different things and affect you in different ways. But I think that the way that it's structured, it allows for, I think, to appreciate parts of the text in a way that if you're just flying through, you can't necessarily get in the same way.
Yeah, that's great. That's funny that you started it with Jim Prothero as well. I interviewed him, I don't know, a couple months ago on his righteousness work.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, Jim's amazing. I was with him in Denver
yeah,
just for SBL, and I just love the heck out of that guy. He's a
yeah,
fantastic guy.
yeah. He's a great guy. So let me ask you this. So obviously you said you have to, cut stuff out. And I think really what you would have to cut out is partly dependent upon how good you are at Greek, right? How quickly you can read through the text. So how comfortable were you at just reading through large swaths of Greek text before you started this? And how comfortable are you now, having gone all the way through?
It's a good question. So this is probably a good time where we could advertise the Biblingo materials, as far as helping one to get to the point where you can take on something like this. It's interesting. I would say, if you just to quick answer, how long does reading this a day take you? I would say if you give it like an hour a day, I think you're probably going to be in good shape. And then if you fall behind a little bit, you might need to have a day or two that you can kind of devote to just doing this, which is, that's the way life works sometimes. My own Greek level was pretty good coming into this. So it's something that I've been working on for, a little over 10 years. And so as far as, reading the New Testament and then reading the early church fathers, I have a pretty good context, already for this. I don't think that somebody necessarily needs to have that much to be able to get into this. Because the thing is, it's sometimes, the question's asked like, hey, what's easier, the Septuagint Greek or the New Testament Greek? And the answer is usually, Septuagint Greek is harder. And the New Testament's easier. And while that's true with respect to some books, if you're going to say, John or Mark or something like that, the Septuagint actually isn't particularly hard to read in most instances. The difference tends to be that we're more familiar with the New Testament than we are with the Old Testament. Yeah. And so you're going through Leviticus and you're like, okay, well, there's not that many different words being used here. I just don't know what any of them are because I don't know what any of these things happen to be. So it's actually not, it's not that difficult when you get going through Genesis. Genesis is a great warm up. I don't think it's a particularly hard book to read, and I don't think that you need to necessarily have more than a couple years proficiency in Greek to be able to do it. Or even if you had first year Greek and had done a good amount of independent reading and pretty familiar with the New Testament. I think you'd be in good shape to give something like this, a shot. And there's stuff that would take more time, definitely. But it's not, this is the whole point of the Septuagint is it's common language. They didn't go and take this to make the text more obscure. The whole reason the Septuagint exists is to make it more accessible to people, to make it more common. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a literary quality to it, because it does. And there's definitely books, like you have with the New Testament. There's a pretty wide variety of language within the Septuagint, so that from a literary standpoint, some of these books, even I was going through just like, I don't know what's going on here. Like this is it's just all over the place. You're looking up literally every other word, and you'll just get every other word will be like that shows up, once in the Septuagint. It's like, great, thanks a lot. But it's something where you don't necessarily need to have some sort of mastery of Greek to be able to get started with something like this, which I think is encouraging.
Yeah, well, and I think even if even if it would be too much, if you couldn't read fast enough, I think like shooting for it and then will at least allow you to read a lot. Even if you don't finish all of it in a year. I think obviously the more you read, the better you're going to get. Do you feel like now you can read better? Or in Greek, like after having done it for a year, do you feel like a noticeable difference in that, or?
Oh yeah.
Even just in like how quickly you can read or comprehension?
Yeah, there's actually a pretty huge difference, which is fun, and which is then easy to go and to apply to other kinds of Greek texts as well. You just being able to pick something up and read it. But I mean, really, the most fun thing is just being able to read the biblical text more quickly, more easily. You pick it up, and there's not a whole lot of pausing or kind of hesitation or having to see. And you'll notice if there's some sort of abnormality in the text, you pick that up immediately and think, okay, there's something weird going on here with this. I wonder what this is. So one of the things that you have to balance in doing something like this is trying to make a balance of how often you're going to look up words. Because if every time that you stop and pause on a word, if you went to go look it up, you would be very slow. You probably wouldn't make it through. And it's the same way with English, actually. It's like most of us, when we're learning how to read, we come across a word that we're not familiar with. We tend to not just sort of pull out like a dictionary and open up. See, we tend to try to use whatever context clues we can to figure out what's going on. And we tend, I think, usually to actually remember it better that way when we've figured it out by intuition, what's going on. And so you end up doing a decent amount of that when you're doing this. And there's definitely been instances where it's like, I should look up this word, I should see what's going on. And those can be really valuable too, because then you start looking at a word, you see, oh, that's the same word that's used here, or this is where it gets really fun. There's all kinds of weird words in the Old Testament where you'll see, and you're like, what is that? And you'll see, wait a second, that's the same word that gets used in the New Testament here. And then you see the New Testament context, and you're like, wait a second, this is totally an allusion back, between there, where the New Testament author has picked this word in order to draw your attention to this other incident, incident in the Old Testament. And those are fantastic, and they're so fun. One of the richest things that has come out of doing this. But you almost have to, you have a lot of kids. I have a lot of kids, but you have to be careful how much you let yourself do those things, because it's really easy to fall behind and just sort of get, spend forever, looking up words and seeing all the connections and stuff. So if you're actually going to, make it through the text, you have to have, it's like, okay, I'm going to give myself like 5 words. I'll allow myself to look up this time, or whatever happens to be.
Yeah, it is. And it's a different way to read, and I think a lot of people, they normally read, these texts very, very closely, which is fine, but and myself included, I'll often, especially I'll get distracted with grammar points. I'll be reading something and I'll say, oh, that's a very interesting use of, the aorist here. Like I need to go write this down and figure out why it's being used this way. And then, I spend the next 10 minutes, thinking about this particular function of the aorist instead of reading. But there's something. So I think that does have benefit, but there's also benefits to just reading. Because in some ways, it's just, we just don't do that in English when we normally like sit down and read a book. We're not like, oh wow, that's such an interesting use of the passive participle. Let me go some people do. I actually would do that kind of thing, but I'm not the ordinary human. But like that is when you're reading to read, you do, like you said, you're not looking words up even if you don't know them. You're just plowing through, and because you're trying to get this sort of like picture, like grand picture, not like every single word, right? And we're often obsessed with every single word. But,
and it's interesting. Just to follow up on that point, because I think there's something that's really valuable that you said there. When we read, we're trying to get the big picture, and the more that you see that, the more you tend to enjoy a work. And so if you've tried to read a book before, but you've read it in like fits and starts, where like I read a chapter or I read a small thing, and then I got lost in my bed for a couple of weeks, and I picked it up and I read another chapter, and then something else was going on, and then a week later I read another chapter. And generally, you tend to enjoy those books less. Mm-hmm. And if I think of like the books that I enjoyed, the most, they tend to be things where I was like, I got this book and I started reading it at like 8 o'clock at night. then I finished it at 3 o'clock in the morning because
Yeah.
I couldn't put it down. And you remember all kinds of stuff, and it's fantastic. What's cool is that there is definitely books, and reading it this way, where you're reading it at a pretty good speed. There's definitely books where I feel like I just, from a standpoint of pure enjoyment, I enjoyed them going at a good pace like this, and going through them in their entirety, way more than I had in any other period. So Leviticus was one this time around. I read pretty quickly, and I'd read the Greek of Leviticus before, but I just really enjoyed it. I just felt like it almost, it's in a funny way, it feels like it's this like advanced civilization, which isn't the way that you would people normally think about it, like Leviticus. But there's such like, I don't know, such a brilliancy to the way the whole thing works. I'd like to do like a thought experiment, thinking like, if Leviticus was something that American, Native American Indians had as part of like their own kind of like cultural heritage. I mean, we would talk about Leviticus like the greatest thing in the universe, and like every whatever kind of Native American Studies department and every state school, you'd all be reading Leviticus and be like, this is the greatest thing that you've ever seen. And it would be true, because it's awesome. There's so much valuable stuff there. The other one I really had this with this time was Second Chronicles. Mm-hmm. And we've been doing some traveling, and so I was behind, and so I had a free day, and I'm like, I really need to make it through Second Chronicles in a day. And so I read through Second Chronicles in a day. And Second Chronicles is not normally on people's kind of like top 10 list necessarily, as far as like their favorite biblical books. Because it's long, and it's kind of stuff you heard before. I mean, I did Second Chronicles in a day, and I was just like, this is amazing. It's so fun, and there's so much cool stuff there. And from a literary standpoint, and reading it in just in one, kind of one day like that, I was really able to see how the whole thing fit together, and how the themes of Second Chronicles kind of held together throughout in a way that, just taking disconnected little sections before, it never really fit together. And so that's one of the great things to reading in this kind of way, is it really can help you to appreciate these texts more from a literary standpoint in some ways, because you're reading them the way that we read books. Sometimes we read scripture in a way that's totally different from the way that we just read other books, and it's possible in so doing to actually lose some of the enjoyment, some of the insight that we might just normally get if we were just pick it up and read it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, there actually is research on the connection between reading speed and reading comprehension, showing that obviously to a point, but the faster you can read, the better you can comprehend, because we can only fit so many things in our brain at one time. So like if you're stopping every other word to look up a word or whatever, then you're just not going to remember like at a discourse level or like a book level what's going on, but if you sit down and read the whole thing very quickly, you still remember what happened in chapter 3 when you get to chapter 20. And so if there is an allusion, you say, oh, I just read that, but you often, we often miss that because we just don't read the scriptures then that way, especially scriptures in the original languages, because we either, don't read fast enough to get there, or we just, look up a Greek or Hebrew word here and there. That's really great. And it would be interesting too, to see if you did that with other books, if it was special to, if it was Second Chronicles that you really liked, or you really liked reading through a book in a day,
Yeah, no, it's a great question. At the very least, what I'm grateful for is, something like Second Chronicles, which is always like, it's there, that it's there for a reason, but you don't necessarily, when you're reading through it, you're not thinking like, oh man, I've been waiting for months to get the Second Chronicles. Today is the day. And having this day where it's like the Second Chronicles day, like, oh, this is awesome. Like, it was a really cool gift to be able to experience that, because then in some ways it helps to put you in touch with earlier Christians who accepted and understood these books as as inspired. It's like, well, why do you what do you, for me, previously reading Second Chronicles, you take it on faith that, there's something that's really valuable here, and you see little things here and there. But in this way, doing it this way, I was like, oh, wow, this is awesome. This is like, you just have a sense of, why you have such a high value place on this text. And so, that's really cool in a way to have our eyes opened to parts of our own heritage that we might not necessarily be as connected with, otherwise. So,
how has it been for you reading through the like apocryphal books? Have those been, just what's been your experience? More interesting, obviously there's probably some, like, depending on how many times you've read through it, like less familiarity with those. So it might be like harder. What are your thoughts on this?
So, it's actually, I have to like almost say in relation to each book, Tobit I've read before. That was delightful. Judith had never read in Greek before. That was absolutely delightful. That was so fun. So that was great. Wisdom of Solomon is one of those where it's still relevant to the New Testament. That if I remember correctly, I think it's I could be wrong. I think it might be the Muratorian canon that actually puts Wisdom of Solomon in the New Testament. And you're like, what? Where does that go? How does Wisdom of Solomon in the New Testament? When you're reading it through in Greek, you can absolutely see that. I think the stuff that you get, the prophetic material in Wisdom of Solomon 2, then go into Wisdom of Solomon 3 and 5. That stuff is amazing, and the stuff as far as giving you a theological framework for understanding things like the Canaanite conquest and stuff like that. It's almost like they have like a an inspired reading guide to earlier parts of the Old Testament, which is so helpful. But Wisdom of Solomon is hard Greek. Like at least for me, that was one of the books where it was slow moving. It feels like it's written at a pretty high literary style. Baruch is just kind of an extension of Jeremiah, and is just kind of saying the same thing as not exactly the same thing, but a lot of the similar themes that you have from Jeremiah, which is Jeremiah itself is actually a pretty easy reading Greek. So that was pretty straightforward. If you think so, I mean, doing Sirach right now as part of the wisdom thing, and so which is I think is great. Sirach is one of the books I'm less familiar with, but every time that I have a look at it, I always get just valuable material. And I think that when you're doing something in an original language like this, because you have to go slower, you tend to be more reflective, and you often catch things that you would have missed otherwise. So there's a bit in Sirach 3 where it says, basically the greater that one becomes, the more humility that you need. And I just, you kind of going through slowly, and I'm thinking about them like, gosh, that's a really good point, because it's so easy to think of like humility as something like you either, you kind of have it or you don't. And not that, no, like the more stature that you're given, the greater that you become, you actually need a larger corresponding amount of humility in order to counterbalance that. Otherwise, it's so easy, to kind of fall off the tracks. And I was like, that's a really good encouragement as far as like, am I constantly trying to grow in humility to like kind of, more and more levels. And this is, I think I was maybe reading this at one of the points at which, my wife was telling me that Kanye was not doing well. And I was sort of thinking about that because I don't follow the news. I don't have time to. But I was thinking, like, man, if only we could get Kanye, Sirach 3, so you would, recognize, man, the greater you become. You might have had sufficient humility previously, but you have to actually get more and more humility in order to, not kind of fall off the wagon. So anyway, if you talk to Kanye, let him know there's.
I will. I think he's on. Be on the podcast next, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to look at the schedule.
Yeah, it's good. It sounds good. Yeah, I heard that he loves Biblingo as well.
So it actually reminds me of Thomas à Kempis as well. What does he say? I would rather feel humility than know how to define it, I think.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that, it's very, especially in the scholarly world, it's easy for us to really work. I mean, rightfully so, really work at understanding and like precision and like knowledge, but it is much rarer to work at humility. Like that's just like not on everyone's like goal, list to start out the year. But it's true, that like you see people, they get fame or really good at something, and then their humility doesn't keep pace, and it creates all kinds of problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you look at Solomon, it's like, I mean, great guy, started off excellent and grew in stature and didn't seem to grow and like, corresponding humility to be able to bear that. And then the consequences for everybody are really sad. So just a really good encouragement that I had, which I, hadn't seen before. So
do you have any other ways that like reading through has changed the way you read the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible? I don't know how your Hebrew is, but looking at it as both as a translation, right, from the Hebrew, and then also as like something that the New Testament writers were interacting with.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's actually great about reading the Septuagint is when you're reading the New Testament authors, and then when you're reading the early church fathers as well, which is the other area that I focus on a lot. It's interesting because they're so steeped in scripture that when they're quoting scripture, it's often in such a way that you don't even know if they know what they're doing. It's like, it's kind of scripture is like, it's like the air that they breathe. And so because of that, they're just naturally citing and alluding to and drawing language from all kinds of places all over the scriptures. And I think that kind of familiarity, when you see, for example, one of the classes that I teach is on Paul's writings, and is one of the books we assigned is Richard Hayes's Echoes of Scripture and the Letters of Paul, which is a great, just delightful book, and seeing how familiar he is with the Old Testament text, so that when he's citing anything, looking at the context of what he's doing, you can see there is like, I mean, he's just a virtuoso in what he does because of how familiar and how steeped in these texts is. And in some ways, I think that the kinds of things that he's doing, when you get to a certain kind of familiarity, it's almost like a precognitive familiarity. If you think of, for instance, like I driving a car, like I drive a stick, and when you learn how to drive, there's a cognitive period where what you're doing, you're thinking about something. What gear am I in right now? Should I be in a different gear? I guess I'm going to do this gear. How do I get into the other gear? And you're thinking about that, and that's all there. And then you do it enough, and then you start doing all of those things in a kind of precognitive way, where you're not even thinking about it. You're just sort of doing it naturally as you're breathing. And I think that kind of familiarity that you see, from the apostles and from the early church fathers, that's kind of the goal to try to get to something that is a fraction of as cool as what they have, because then you can see and you can appreciate the kinds of things that they're doing with their language and how it is that they see the entirety of God's revelations as fitting together. And so that's one of the things for me in reading through the text. There's so many places, just reading through the Septuagint, once like this. I mean, literally every page I have underlined someplace where it's like, oh, that's the same language the New Testament uses here, or that's the same, the same language that gets used over here. And honestly, it's part of why I have to do this again next year, is because I have so many examples of them that, like, there's no way I can possibly remember all of them and just going through and doing it once. But it's so enjoyable seeing that and seeing, not just at a level of, narrative or theology, but a narrative of, just the exact language, exact words themselves. They are, they're like they make use of the same phrases, etc. And there's places in New Testament interpretation that, I think that this actually can really help us. There's it's the page I have open here is Hosea 2, and I noticed in reading Daniel, so Daniel 2 and then Daniel 7, and here in Hosea 2, you have eschaton ton hemeron, or eschaton hemeron, so the last days. And it's interesting because you see that language in the New Testament, and a lot of the times when that language is used, the debate from a scholarly standpoint has to do with, like, the second coming of Christ, in the sense of, like, the end of the world. Like, is this, like, does the Left Behind movie start right now? Does it not start right now? It's interesting, New Testament debates around that, kind of stuff like, the last days. It tends to, the lens you're seeing that through, it is almost like Left Behind. It's like, are these the actual last days? Is in the sense that, is the earth going to end? Will the space-time continuum be brought, to a standstill? How is all that going to work? And which is interesting, because you're just kind of like, I don't really, for some reason, that doesn't seem to fit in a narrative standpoint exactly with what's either going on in the immediate context or more broadly with the Old Testament context. But it's like, well, what would they mean if they're talking about the last days instead? And this is one of those, when you're reading through, the Old Testament, it jumps off the page. So Daniel 2, Daniel 7, what was it talking about? The dream that Daniel has is that what's going to happen in the last days. Well, what's going to happen in the last days? Well, the kingdom of God is going to come in the last days. And the kingdom of God that's coming in the last days is going to establish a kingdom that's going to be forever. And so if you think of the stone cut without hands, it goes in Daniel 2 and crushes the statue, turns into a mountain, and then everybody goes and flocks to it. That being the last days doesn't mean, hey, this is the end of the world. This means this is the inauguration of the kingdom of God. This is when everything that God said was going to happen is now going to happen here on earth. So too in Daniel 7, you get the same phrase used with the Son of Man, that, the four beasts, Son of Man comes down, all the cool stuff happens. And that's what happens in the last days. So too Hosea 2 uses the exact same phrase. It's in the exact same kind of context, where it's like you have this cosmic restoration, this new covenant that's established in the last days. Then when you turn to the New Testament, you hear last days. It helps you to think, wait a second, this means it's Daniel 2 time, it's Daniel 7 time, it's Hosea 2 time. And if somebody wants to come along and say the last days, it must mean, like, the United Nations is taking over, the end of the world is near. I can then say, Kevin, I don't know if that's exactly what and how that language, really, really works in context. So there's different things like that I think are really, really helpful, from a standpoint of New Testament interpretation, where you can see if your reading of these texts isn't conditioned by the Old Testament and by the language that you see, here in the Septuagint, how it's easy to get it wrong and then go into all kinds of other, interesting but not ultimately, constructive directions.
So just to play devil's advocate here, why would you need to read it in Greek to get that?
Yeah.
So like because presumably the English is going to match up, right? Last days.
Yeah.
Even if the English is coming from Hebrew, like something like that.
Yeah.
You're probably going to have last days in English in Hosea 2, and then you're going to have the same thing in the New Testament. So why read the Greek for it? I mean, obviously, I'm an advocate for reading the Greek, but
it's a really good question. So the way that I would answer that is, I would answer that by saying that the nature of an English translation is that it has a wider degree of variability in the way that it translates the underlying terms with, when it comes to any original language. So, I'm writing a justification article right now, which has been taking me But it seems like my whole life. And it's interesting because you have the root, dikaios, dikaio, everything like that. And so great, we'll just translate that into English, and you just kind of keep the same word, the same root, and that should be simple. But it ends up not being simple. If you look in English, in Romans 3, it's like 3:21 to 28, something like that. You see words with the dikaios root 10 times, and your average translation, so if you take like the NRSV, 5 times it will translate that using justice terms, so just, justification, and then 5 times it'll use the righteous root, so right, righteous, rectified, and it alternates between, it just bounces back and forth. It just doesn't have a kind of consistency to it. And so because of that, Paul uses the same root 10 times. We get 5 roots over here, and from this one English set, and 5 roots over here in this other English set. And that's maybe kind of an extreme example, but it's not in any way surprising if you see the way that translations work. And I think particularly when you're thinking how most modern translations work, they work with translation committees, and so you have a committee of people who are all doing this. So Kevin gets Daniel, here, go and translate Daniel, and whoever is translating Mark is going to be somebody else who is going to do that. And so the particular way that they use that language is such that they might use the same English terms to express those things, and they might not. And the broader variability between English translations is such that any of us, I don't know if this was like 100 years ago, if you could probably allude to the King James version, and most of us have an idea, but there's so many different English translations. There's so many different ways of saying any given thing when you're translating into English that even when we go and say like a common verse that everybody knows, probably not everybody has that verse memorized in the same words. And so if you think Proverbs 3, 5 and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, he will lead your path straight. Or is it make your path straight, or he will direct your paths? Or which one is it? And they're actually, you can make it justify all kinds of translations there. And so everybody has it memorized in kind of a different way. What's great about the Septuagint is you just have a lot less variability. You just have the original language from the standpoint of the New Testament, and then you have this translation that's made that has a really kind of stable, consistent quality to it, which is itself what the New Testament authors are drawing upon directly. So it's not to say that you can't see those kinds of connections, because I think that you can often, which is why there's value to reading the Bible in translation. What it is to say is that often when it's brought through those intermediaries, you don't see those connections as clearly. Whereas here, eschaton ton himmeron, you're like, wait a second, I know that phrase. I know exactly where that comes from. And so that's why, having some familiarity, I think, with New Testament Greek, and then going back into the Septuagint is such a delight and just so much fun.
I also just wonder how much is it's that we don't read the Old Testament enough, just like straight up, just like the phrase "the last days" is not like making us think, oh, you're talking about Hosea too, like we're just, because we don't encounter it there first. It's just like, and so when you go back and read it in Greek and you're going more slowly, then it's like, oh, that's funny, right? Because you've already the phrase from the New Testament, and then you see it in Greek in the Old Testament, you say, oh, this is probably referring to this. I just hadn't noticed it before. And I think that is actually a really valuable part of reading in the original. Not that it is even different necessarily than what you might see in English, but you see it differently, right? Because you are paying not even more attention, but you are for whatever reason, you're just seeing things that you don't see in English. It's honestly hard to explain when people ask, like, what's the value of reading Greek and Hebrew? I'm like, it's actually hard, because it's like everything is different. Like it's all, I mean, yes, your translations are good and like you can rely on them, and whatever.
Yeah.
But there's just no substitute for reading it in the original language, and you just see things. You just see the whole world of the text differently. So
yeah, it's like, I mean, you can use an analogy to say it's like it's looking at the same thing from a different vantage point.
Yeah,
it's like, if you're reading an English translation, can you see the reality that's there? Absolutely. And I think that God can use stuff within our English translations to help us see the realities that are there that are fantastic. And so that's all great. What's amazing with the original languages is how you can, in a sense, ascend a bit to have an even better vantage point. And there's things within the vantage point that's maybe a bit higher up that you either might not. There's no way that you could see them without the original language. Where like that is an awesome thing that's there that I just had no idea from where I was at previously, or things that were perhaps obscure from the original vantage point, which you then go into the original language and you're like, oh, I can see this here. I can see what was unclear previously from this vantage point. I know I can see what's happening.
So I have two more questions. One is I really can't help myself but ask what the premise of your justification or paper on however you want to translate that term is. Nikasune. I actually did my dissertation on the tzedek roots in Hebrew, which is the equivalent Hebrew root. So do you have a 2-minute elevator pitch that you're willing to share with us on?
So the article is for the St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology, and which is a great resource that is it's basically the equivalent in theology to what the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy does in philosophy. So the idea is to have an open source encyclopedia that's available online that has peer-reviewed articles that you can have a starting point when it comes to any idea within Christian theology, and so that which is actually citable itself, and so you don't have to be getting stuff off of Wikipedia, which isn't like an anti-Wikipedia thing, but it's just like to have something that is actually peer reviewed, that is available as an academic source that can be a first kind of starting point for people when it comes to these things. So that's what the article is. I got roped into it by Mike Bird, who I really appreciate. And Mike originally asked if I could co-write it with him. He did biblical stuff. I did the history interpretation stuff. And then he had too many things to do. And so he asked if I would just go and take the whole thing. So it's basically, I've been working on it as, on the side for this entire calendar year as I've been doing this. And it's pretty much done at this point. I just have a couple of things left, and then I'm going to cut down some words. So hopefully early in the new year, it'll be up on the site there once it makes it through the kind of review and edits and everything. But it is an introduction biblically to the idea of justification, looking at kind of interpretive questions and stuff, and then taking through the history of interpretation of justification through all these different kind of confessional lenses.
Nice. Any insights from the Septuagint on the question?
So insights from the Septuagint when it comes to the justification question?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, absolutely. One of the things that is interesting is the range of usage for that verb, dikaiao, in different ways that it can be used. It just has a wide range of flexibility within. If you read the Septuagint and the different, if you think of something in relation to the concept of righteousness, as far as to be considering as righteous, to do what is right for someone, to set right, and then along with that to actually make right or to make righteous. You're going to see all kinds of instances, all over the place where it seems like in one instance or another, any of those seem like they're the primary idea that's in view. And so it gives you, I guess, a really rich base to draw from when you're looking at New Testament interpretation, just because it's not necessarily a really circumscribed term when it comes to the way that this is used in the Old Testament, which then I think makes it so that when it comes to New Testament interpretation, you have maybe a bit broader sense of the ways that these things can be used and the kinds of things they can mean and then have as implications, rather than it just must be this one thing or just this one thing over here in a more kind of black and white sense. And so,
which is what people normally say, you just, is it forensic? Is it not? It's like that is right. The question really is, what is it here and why? Right.
Right.
Not like, we should know that the term can be used in all these different kinds of ways, right? Yeah. So then you have to argue for your case in this passage, right? And why?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's totally right. And it's just interesting the way that language gets used. There's a number of places. I end up coming to Romans 4 a lot, and where it talks about justifying the ungodly, the God who justifies the ungodly, because he just literally, in a number of places, it seems like in the Old Testament, that is the opposite of what is supposed to happen. Like, God is not going to justify the ungodly. You should not justify the ungodly. You have, the same kind of language that's used. And so, I guess I would say, this would be a point at which, St. Augustine's understanding of justification in Romans 4 as not just like a kind of let him off the hook forensically, but no, this is how Abraham was actually made into a godly person. That sense of justify definitely is easier to reconcile with the Old Testament sort of precedents that you see, because if it is otherwise, at least in that instance, if it is just like in a kind of acquittal, if there's not a lot of texts that say that's a bad thing, don't do that, God's not going to do it, therefore you shouldn't do it either. So anyway, that's one small note. And if you put me here at the microphone, I would literally talk for 24 hours about it.
Yeah, well, I would participate, but my wife would not would not let me, because she would probably break through the door eventually.
Yeah, that's true. Probably your kids too.
And my kids actually would definitely. My 2-year-old for sure would not make it that long. So just a couple. Well, just one last question. So, what else? Again, someone says to you, okay, I'm interested in this thing. Convince me one more time in 30 seconds, read the Septuagint in a year. And if they are convinced, are you taking, offers on, joining the Facebook group or like, how would they go about doing it? Obviously you're inaccessible now because you have crawled in your hole and are just reading the Septuagint by yourself. So are they required to do the same? Or what do they do?
It's a great question. So Kevin's going to set up a Facebook group.
I'm pretty committed. So I printed out my sheet. I started on a couple of days in, and then my wife had a baby, so I had to stop.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But yeah, I would definitely be in on the train. You can also answer it for me. I will not be setting up a Facebook group. I try really hard not to be on Facebook very much, but people say things to me sometimes and I feel bad, so I'm on there. But so I can't say with any kind of confidence that we're going to be spending tons of time on Facebook next year either. But there is a group. If anybody wants to start a new one and kind of organize stuff, that's awesome. For a while, me and Jim and other people were sharing stuff from the texts that we were reading, when we happened to be on there, which was actually really fun. It was a great way to record kinds of things. And I honestly, I really enjoyed it for a while. I was trying to talk Jim into saying, hey, maybe we could do like a short kind of podcast, each month or something like that, just to kind of go over some of the stuff that we've got.
And then just the time that's required from doing this was such that it just ended up not being possible. But the thing is there if anybody wants to go and read it. So that's what I'm going to be following. If anybody wants to organize stuff more, they can. I can give you a few things, and I'll just highlights of things that I've come across that you just read and you're like, this is awesome. What cool connections. The one that first got me into this, where I was like, this is so interesting, was through reading Joshua and Septuagint. And you have in Joshua 7 with Achan, it uses in the beginning this verb nephizo or nephizomai. And I'm thinking, what the heck is that? And I looked up and it says purloin. And I'm like, great, purloin. I don't know what that means either. I know that there's a Pokemon called purloin. I don't know, besides that, it turns out it's a fancy word for to steal. I think that's cool. But it turns out I was kind of looking it up, and it's oh, this is the same thing it's used in Acts 5, and it gets used once there and then once over here. And Acts 5, what's going on in Acts 5? And you think, wait a second, there's a really interesting connection here, and you can see what Luke is doing. So Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira. Well, what's happening in the context? Well, you've got basically, in Acts 5, you are now entering the promised land in the sense that the Holy Spirit has come down. Everything that has been promised in the past is now being brought to fulfillment. And in this time of the promise being fulfilled, you have people within the community who are acting in a way that is out of accordance with what God has commanded, and who are going against what their own conscience in a sense. And so Ananias and Sapphira, what they do with the money, it says that they nephizo it. They purloin it. They use this one really, really rare word to see it, and as a result, they forfeit their lives. And the reason they forfeit their lives is not because you automatically, purloining, carries a death sentence. What it tells you, I think, is something about the way that God is acting in a unique way in this moment. And so it's if you think of this is more spatially, but if you think of the Holy of Holies and and the Ark, it's the closer you get to holiness, the bigger the consequences are. So you touch the Ark and you're in an impure state. It's you're up in smoke, you're gone. So too when God is acting in a way that is kind of climactically fulfilling the things that he's promised, whether you're Achan at originally entering the promised land in a physical sense, and purloining from Jericho, or whether you're Ananias and Sapphira and the new covenant and purloining in that sense. Either way, you can see that you end up having a similar result, which is itself if you're thinking in terms of Acts 5, is a kind of interesting confirmation that the same spirit that worked in Joshua in this period is the same spirit that's at work now in Acts 5, doing a similar kind of thing. So that connection for me was one of the first that got me into it. There's other connections that you'll see. The book of Isaiah, for example. I can't remember if it's Jerome or Augustine who refers to it as a fifth gospel. It says this, the book of Isaiah, it's numbered among the prophets, but if you see how clearly it's talking about the events of Christ and his advent, you don't know whether to place it among the gospels or among the prophets. And I've always had a pretty good appreciation for Isaiah, but you read Isaiah in the Septuagint and you will know exactly what they're talking about. You read it and you're like, this might be misplaced. It might be better to go just put it in the New Testament, put it after John or Mark or something, because it really does. You just reading page after page, I can't believe this is here. I can't. It's just unbelievable. And I think particularly 40 onwards, which is of course what Christ's ministry starts with John the Baptist, making straight the way of the Lord. That material, when you're reading through it in Greek, I think it jumps out to you in a way that it's for me, it is a level I never experienced with it. And then it's also, you can just see the New Testament authors are just drawing on that language everywhere, all over the place. And so there's so many places where you see, oh, that's what Paul is doing here. That's what, Peter is doing here. That's what John is doing in this one passage. And so it's amazing on its own. And then, the way that it enriches your, you're reading the New Testament. And then, honestly, there's too much to do here. I could even say from the very beginning. I remember the first day doing this, because you can't give like a 365 day thing. But if you're saying like the first day, if you got, Genesis 1 and 2, there's little things that you notice in the text that jump out to you. You think that's really interesting. So if you just take day one, when God creates, for example, God created and he saw that it was good. And we're used to saying, good, and good is, kind of, functional or maybe ethical terms. And so I expected it to be, agathos or, agathon. And that's not what it is here. It's kalos, or here, kalon. He saw that it was kalos. And kalos usually gets used in the kind of aesthetic sense. So like, beautiful, and we'll often translate kalos as beautiful. And there's definitely, it's not like a hard and fast kind of thing. There's definitely overlap between the terms, but that's often what we'll do is we'll translate kalos as beautiful. And so you think, and God saw that it was beautiful. You think, oh, that's actually really interesting, the way that, you think of God as an artist when he's creating. It's not simply, that this is, has utility, but that there's something that's beautiful about this. And that's, he's just creating beauty. If you think, things that you catch in the original language is easy to miss in translation. The way that, so later on in Genesis 1, the parallelism with the verb, so arco, so we get as arco, archimon in the New Testament, so to rule. And you hear it's really easy in the original, I guess it's a translation, but you know what I mean? The original translation language. The parallelism between the way that the sun and the moon are set in the sky, so there's to rule over the world, and you get the language, so arco, that's paralleled by the way that we are set in creation to similarly rule over all of the creatures that are around. So the relationship between the sun and moon, and then all the kind of created order, the world around here, we're to kind of have that, I guess you could say that role in relation to all of the living things that we see here. Just a really cool parallel you see. And then maybe one more interesting. This is something that Augustine points out. And again, when you read through the text, you can see where it's coming from. You think of, what's the first building in the Bible? What's the first building? I'll ask you, Kevin. What's this question? What's the first building in the Bible?
Oh man. Well,
hard question.
I'm just like working backwards. I feel like Babel is too late, but
it is, yeah. So I'll give like this. It's a tricky one. Eve is the first building. Eve is the first building. So the first place where you get to know, it's in relation to Eve. And so before that, you've had, all these things are created. God creates this, and then Eve is interestingly built. And Augustine talks about this in relation to Ephesians 5, and how it is that Paul in Ephesians 5 refers to the church as built up. And he says that's the same thing that Adam and Eve, when God takes Eve out of Adam, he takes from Adam, and then from his flesh goes and builds Eve. He says it's the same way with Christ and the church. We're taken from his flesh. It's his body, it's his blood, which goes and gives us life. And so we are taken, if you think of, the lance in his side, we're taken literally from his side, from his rib, the same way that Eve was taken from his rib. And we too, again, using the verb that Paul uses, we are then built up into his, into body, into the church, which is, the counterpart, to Eve. Really, really fun and interesting stuff. And you can see, Augustine saying something like that. It's not just a kind of flight of fancy allegorizing, anything like that. It's actually really close attention to the specifics of the text within, these original languages that helps him to see these kinds of connections, which, I mean, if his instinct is right, is actually the same things that, parallels that Paul is pointing out as well. So those are a couple things on like the first day's reading.
Yeah. It reminds me of like rabbinic literature as well, how they would read texts. And obviously, it's the whole world. These guys are all in very similar worlds, the same world actually. but it is this sort of like midrashic allegorizing, like really close reading kind of thing, where it's like it sometimes it does feel like, oh, can you do that? I don't know. But it's always very careful attention, to what's being said. This, and the fact that Paul was in that world, means that like that's how we should read it. So I mean, it's would make a whole lot of sense, right, if he was picking up on something like that, because that's just what people did.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's great because you actually, even if one is uncomfortable as far as, hey, can I do that? As far as can I do what it seems like Paul is doing there? What you can absolutely agree on is what Paul is doing is important. It's important for us, and it's in a sense definitive for us. And so something like this, it's really great for getting a sense of what it is that Paul is doing, and to be able to appreciate all of the the intricacy and nuance. And
wow, that's fun. I really should have answered that question better, because I actually did read Genesis 2 just the other day in Greek. I don't know if I really caught that or not. I mean, I think it is Vayiven. He built in Hebrew as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's one of the weird ways St. Augustine often, what's the best word to use? Often criticized for not being sufficiently good at languages, but actually there's some close attention that he has. He can be really underrated in this area. So.
Yeah, all those guys. I mean, a lot of them, I feel like, it is Vayiven Adonai. I feel like they're pretty underrated in terms of, I mean, they do their text so well. It's just like, cool. Yeah. Well, this is exciting. I like I said, I have my sheet printed out, and I will be off Facebook as much as possible, and on the Septuagint train. So I might even go ahead and get started in case I lag behind. If we have another baby or something. Actually, that's not going to happen. But anyway, this was a lot of fun. Thank you a lot for sharing your experience, and maybe we can just plan on doing this again next year. Having another recap for all the people, that join this Septuagint train.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's a great idea. We should absolutely do that. It'd be fun.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review. You can also follow Biblingo on social media to discuss the episode with us and other listeners. And don't forget to visit biblingo.org to start your 10-day free trial of Biblingo.